So one thing I've covered quite a bit is how much better off we are with free trade, and I believe it was Jacob who pointed me to this blog post on Vox Populi, an Austrian case against free trade, which on the face of it has really got to be one of the dumbest things that anyone ever said, because, I mean, just overwhelmingly the evidence shows how much better off we are with free trade, and all the arguments against it seem to be thinly disguised jingoism or nationalism or even outright racism. So he talks about this Gary North column, Free Trade, the Litmus Test of Economics. I haven't bothered to read it. Gary North is someone I have problems with, let's just say, on a lot of issues. Free trade isn't one of them, but I'm not going to be defending Gary North here. I'm going to be defending the concepts of free trade in general. And so one of the things Vox says is, quote, "One of the interesting things about myopic free traders like North is that they stubbornly refuse to pay any attention to economic history or the observable consequences of their logic when it is tested by real-world application." Well, isn't it funny that when I look around, exactly the opposite is the truth? Because I look at people like Tom Woods, he's all the time going through history, talking about the lessons we learned from that. I do that too. I look at all sorts of things going on in history and in the real world today, both in my videos and in my podcast. And I think Vox really shows his thinking with this next part. This is why they are constantly retreating to oft-refuted arguments that are more than 200 years old. Yep, the argumentum ad tempus. It's bad because it's old. It's kind of like the reverse argument from antiquity. Both of those are argumentum ad tempus. Anytime you make an argument based on how old the concept is, it's argumentum ad tempus. Of course, free trade restrictions are even older than that because they go back to ancient Greek and Roman times. But that's amazing how they never seem to bring that part up. No. Free trade is the new idea. But anyway, rather than attempting to defend their position on the basis of the post-NAFTA performance of the U.S. economy or the economic state of the European Common Market, now known as the European Union. Okay, when you're looking at the performance of the U.S. economy post-NAFTA, or even for basically since the 1960s all total, it's not that great. In a good year, we do, 3% growth? Whereas in the 19th century, it was more like 5 to 7%. So, yeah, maybe we are looking back then and thinking, hey, we want those same growth levels. But that means you want children to go back to work. Oh, shut up. Yeah. Don't even try it. So anyway, he says, contrast North's superficial and outdated polemic. Gotta love those weasel words there. Polemic, that's another word that doesn't really mean anything, but you can use it to discredit what someone says without actually responding to it. With Pat Buchanan's WorldNet Daily column. Yes, because when I think of logic and rationality and looking at history and real-world data, Pat Buchanan and WorldNet Daily are just two names that immediately spring to the front of my mind. Sheesh. Okay, so what does Buchanan say? He says, quote, "The entry into force of the U.S.-Korea trade agreement on March 5th, 2012 means countless new opportunities for U.S. exporters to sell more made-in-America goods, services, and agricultural products to Korean customers and support more good jobs here at home. Thus did the office of the U.S. Trade Representative rhapsodize," there's another good word, rhapsodize, "about the potential of our," why can't they just say, he said it. "About the potential of our new trade treaty with South Korea. And how has it worked out for Uncle Sam? Well, courtesy of Martin Kurtzinger of the Associated Press, the trade figures are in for April, the first full month under the trade deal with South Korea. Because that's how long it takes for long-term effects of the economy to kick in. Just 1 month. And surprise, the U.S. trade deficit with Korea tripled in 1 month. You know a good way to let me know that you have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to international trade under the phrase trade deficit. I have a video on this. It's an older one and not very good audio and lower resolution, so I might redo it. But basically, there's no such thing as a trade deficit. Because any quote-unquote trade deficit you might have, importing more than you export, is balanced out by the exchange rate. So there's that balancing factor. So if something weird's happening, then it's because, Venezuela fixing the exchange rate of the bolivar with the dollar. You know, like Argentina did in the 90s. That worked out so well for them, too. Yeah. And, of course, every country is trying to manipulate their exchange rates, and there's nothing new about that. But with proper free trade, you wouldn't be doing that. And so, with an exchange rate set by purely market forces, you would have the exchange rate balance out any imbalance between imports and exports. Well, then why does it happen? Well, it's because goods and services are only one thing you can get with money. You can also invest. And this is why so few economists actually use the phrase trade deficit. They say net foreign investment. Because you've got country A and country B, and they're importing and exporting a certain amount, and let's say at this amount, everyone agrees it's not a trade deficit. Then all of a sudden, people in country A decide they want to invest in businesses in country B because things are going so great there and they want a part of that. So they start investing in businesses. People in country B all of a sudden go, oh, that's a trade deficit. Because the exchange rates aren't just about goods being imported and exported, it's also about investment. But if the same number of goods are being imported and exported, and the only thing that's changed is the amount of foreign investment, then how all of a sudden is it a trade deficit? So that is stupid. And that's what Buchanan says. Imports from South Korea jumped 15% to $5.5 billion in April, while U.S. exports to South Korea fell 12%, blah-bitty-blah-bitty-blah. Okay, so what happened to net foreign investment? How many Koreans are wanting to invest in American businesses and American accounts and invest in the dollar and get American bank accounts, stuff like that? So anyway, back to Vox. Verdict: Buchanan brutally kicked North's ass. Yeah, North, he kicked your ass. Ooh. Really? Okay, yeah, so we're on the 6th grade playground again. North's only response to this would be to celebrate the growing trade deficit because the world is richer than it was in 1973. Regardless of whether that is true or not. No, wait, why do you say regardless? Because if the whole world is richer, if the rising tide has lifted all boats, then aren't we better off too? Even allowing for this so-called trade deficit? But no, he goes on to say, the more relevant fact is that the United States of America is considerably poorer than it was in 1973, with lower wages, higher unemployment, and reduced net wealth. Okay, yeah. Why are we picking 1973, by the way? It's just before the energy crunch, isn't it? And just before all of the effects of getting off of the Bretton Woods system really gets kicked into place. Yeah, so where are we starting there? At any rate, it's not true. You want proof that it's not true? Just look in your pocket, okay? I'm not talking about looking for change. I'm talking about something that almost all of us have, even poor people. I'm talking about your cell phone. Because what is a cell phone nowadays? They're smartphones. They didn't even have cell phones in 73. That wasn't even an option. Okay, we might have to go to 93, which is the year that Buchanan mentioned. But let's think about it. What did you have? Okay, if you wanted a phone that you could take anywhere and make calls with anywhere, you had to get one of those big bag phones for your car. And they were several $100s. And then what else did you need? Okay, a computer, that's a few $1,000s. A monitor to display it on, another few hundred. Oh God, those monitors were behemoths, weren't they? Those big glass tube monitors. Hey, I've got my 12-inch monitor. I'm going to pick up my 12-inch monitor. Ugh! Heavy. And then, of course, you had to get online. And in order to get online in 1993, you had to buy a modem, which was this other clunky thing. I mean, don't drop these things on your toes. Ow, I dropped a Hayes modem on my toe. Okay, another couple hundred probably. And let's see what else. Okay, there's a camera. All right, you had to pay, I guess you could get like a Polaroid or something. What were Polaroids? $40 back then? We'll have to adjust for inflation, but GPS device, those were thousands. And then let's see, a tape recorder, a gaming system, like a Nintendo or something. There's another couple hundred. You probably also want like a calculator. But I mean, we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for all of those. Thousands all total to get all of that together that you can get in a smartphone for less than $100. You go to Walmart and get one of those contract-free smartphones, that you just pay as you go. Or if you want something a little bigger, you can get a tablet for $50. You get a Kindle or whatever. $50! And you can play some of those. The tablet doesn't have the phone functions. Well, I guess it kind of does if you're talking about Skype. Hey, you can video conference with Skype. In 93, the only way you could do that was to be rich. And have this big corporation and do the video conferencing on that. Now everyone can video conference. We've done it several times. So how are we poorer then? When you can get thousands of dollars worth of electronics for less than 100, for double digits. How is that being poorer? It's about purchasing power. And by the way, one reason why the smartphone was able to do so much and be so cheap is free trade. Free trade played a huge role in making the smartphone what it is today. Oh, but it's Vox that's looking at the real world. Okay, yeah, right. So he says, while there is no question that North's ideological heart is in the right place, his intellectual limitations in the field of economics become readily apparent when one sees how he praises Henry Hazlitt's hapless attempt to justify free trade. Another one of those great words, hapless. Henry Hazlitt's classic little book, Economics in One Lesson, so completely destroys the arguments of the tariff supporters that there is nothing left of their position. Still, they keep coming. For 2 centuries, their position has been intellectually bankrupt. Still, they keep coming. I found this statement more than a little amusing, of course, because it was trivially easy to show how Hazlitt's book not only fails to completely destroy the anti-free trade case, but is a remarkably incompetent argument when examined in detail. I say this because I identified no less than 13 specific errors in his chapter on free trade in the first and second parts of the Hazlitt International Trade Challenge. Like most conventional, if not mainstream economists, what's the difference? North is handicapped by his failure to pay any attention to debt. Or maybe he knows that the trade deficit is BS, as I just explained. And that's what it is. He goes over the trade deficit, that's that yellow bar. Oh, look how big it is compared to the population and GDP per capita. Oh, how terrible! People in foreign countries want to invest in the United States. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much his entire argument here. We can just scroll through it because his numbers are basically BS, because they're based on this idea of the trade deficit being this horrible thing. And so he adds in the overall debt level of the economy, which, quote, makes it obvious how the trade deficit is impoverishing the USA despite the increase in GDP. Yeah, because correlation is causation all of a sudden. How does the trade deficit lead to more debt? All right, let's think about this. Okay, investment in one direction is debt in the other direction. You invest in a company, that company is indebted to you. You buy bonds in them, they have to pay the bonds back with interest. But what did foreigners do to all of a sudden make all these businesses and everyone else go into debt to them when they wouldn't have anyway? No, that's not how it happens, people. The business says, okay, we want to get investment dollars in, and so we're willing to pay it back at this rate of interest. What does the fact that some of it is now coming from foreign sources, what does that have to do with anything? I mean, it's going to be the same level of debt no matter what, even if 100% of it is domestic. About the only part that would make sense is the national debt, the U.S. debt, the debt that the government is getting us all into, which is, of course, crazy and way out of control. But that's not a free trade issue. That's a fiscal and monetary policy issue. So, I mean, you want to complain about that, I'm behind you. But that doesn't have anything to do with free trade. And by the way, you know how I was talking earlier about manipulating exchange rates? That's one way they do it. They print a whole bunch of money and put it in the exchange markets. And that supposedly tips the exchange markets in their favor. The U.S. is doing that with China. Of course, China doesn't want that to happen. So China prints up a bunch of yuan and puts it in the exchange market, exchanging it for dollars, and they hold the dollars in reserve. The U.S. is doing the opposite, so both sides are trying to manipulate the exchange rate, and it just kind of cancels it out. So if you understand that, you understand why this paragraph here is bogus. The prosperity that North and others claim free trade has brought the USA is nothing but a mirage and is the simple result of Americans borrowing to buy those foreign goods and services with money they will have to pay back from a smaller industrial base. Now, why does industrial matter? Smaller industrial base competing against much more serious competitors they faced 50 years ago. Okay, first of all, the industrial sector of the U.S. is doing great. I mean, even in this kind of down economy, it's still close to the highest it's ever been. So yeah, we're actually good at that. But I mean, this is something else we see. They're like, okay, we're going to carve out just this one little sector and look at that. And that's not the entire economy, people. That's not the entire economy. There's all sorts of things going on nowadays. Yeah, industry is a smaller portion of the overall economy because we're doing lots of other stuff as well, stuff that didn't exist in 1973 or even 1993. But you see, that's the problem when you just try and look at one of these tiny little areas and say, oh, look at this is horrible, without considering the overall picture. I'm really amazed at how economists do both fallacies at the same time. They look at whatever little part of the economy they want to without considering the overall picture. Or when they do consider the overall picture, they do it by removing it from the context of its parts. You know, I've talked about this before, how they look at the equations and it's all this aggregate stuff, and they say, okay, we'll change one variable and assume that the other variables won't change, when of course that's not the case, because people are going to respond to the change in ways that you can predict if you just look at that, but they don't. So it's weird. They make both fallacies at the same time. The case for free trade was always logically flawed, and on the empirical level, simply cannot survive the incorporation of debt into the equation. No, he just doesn't understand debt and what its relation to free trade is. As the historical statistics clearly demonstrate the intrinsic falsity that was always apparent to the sufficiently careful economic analyst. This from someone who doesn't even understand what a trade deficit is and why the concept is bogus. Free trade has not made the USA more wealthy any more than buying giant houses with no money down mortgages during the housing boom made those individuals who bought them rich. Okay, so he's comparing it to a financial bubble. This idiot is comparing free trade to a financial bubble. What on earth is going on in international trade that is anything resembling the market manipulations our government engaged in that created the housing bubble? You know, it says, it hardly amounts to state worship to note that debt is not wealth. Oh God, how many times, people? Say's law! You need investment! You need investment to keep things going! It's like the old analogy about the two guys on the deserted island, and they're trying to get fish, and they can catch like one fish a day. One guy decides he's going to go hungry for a day and builds a net, and now he can catch 3 fish a day. Because he decided to go for a day without having as much wealth as he ordinarily would, because that means he's going to get a greater amount of wealth later on. That's investment. That's what it is. It's deferred gratification. It's people saying, okay, I have this wealth, but I'm not going to consume it today. I'm going to invest in this company or something and get a return on my investment. Now, again, if he's talking about government debt, the national debt, he's got a point, because I mean, there's nothing stopping the government from just, oh God, what is it now? 19 trillion or something like that? What's the debt clock say? Yeah, 19.4 trillion, almost 19.5 trillion. Because they're not going to be the ones who have to pay it back. They're not the ones who have to suffer. They'll tax us. But ordinary investment, ordinary debt doesn't work that way. The company knows they have to pay the debt. Just like when you buy a house and you mortgage it, you get a mortgage to pay for the house. You know you have to pay that mortgage back. So, yeah. Not understanding the nature of debt, not understanding investment, not understanding Say's law. What else is new? And it should be clear that by depriving the local consumers of their jobs and their ability to pay for imported goods and services, free trade necessarily requires either a decline in living standards or a constantly increasing debt load for countries on the red side of the trade deficit. How is it free trade that's costing us our jobs? Free trade would be creating jobs. He doesn't say. He doesn't have any mechanism whatsoever for free trade destroying jobs and free trade reducing incomes. The more trade you have, whether local or international, increases the opportunities for employment and increases the opportunities to make money for both sides. You know, his long refuted arguments, earlier he mentioned David Hume and Adam Smith. Funny how he didn't mention David Ricardo. Law of comparative advantage, people? Where's the debunking of that? Huh? He doesn't even mention it. Law of comparative advantage, look it up. If you don't understand the law of comparative advantage, and you can't explain why it's so counterintuitive, but also why we know it has to be true, then I don't want to hear a word you have to say about free trade. In fact, I don't want to hear a word you have to say about economics all total. There's a good litmus test, okay? You want to talk to me about economics? Explain David Ricardo's law of comparative advantage. Explain why it's counterintuitive, but also why we know it has to be true. If you can't do those things, I don't want to talk to you. Go away. And so, as strange as it may sound, this observation points towards the legitimate possibility of developing the apparently oxymoronic Austrian case against free trade. So he doesn't actually give an Austrian case against free trade. He just says, hey, maybe we should have one. And yet he called his article an Austrian case against free trade, which kind of implies that he was promising to give us one when he doesn't have one. So, yeah, the problem isn't free trade. The problem is overregulation of the economy. The problem is the highest corporate tax rate in the world. The problem is government putting the screws on businesses right and left. So, yeah, this was one big basically move along, nothing to see here. If you understand why the trade deficit is bogus, then that's all you need. That's all you need to destroy this entire screed and its non-arguments. So, another one bites the dust. But maybe at some point someone will make a good effort to debunk free trade and free markets based on actual logic and really observing the real world and history and stuff like that. But I'm still waiting. Still waiting. Until then, stay strong and be free.